One morning, without warning, every piece of technology on Earth dropped dead. No dramatic sparks, no Hollywood-style explosions. Just nothing. The entire planet blinked and woke up in the year 1823. And welcome to What If Horizons, the only podcast where we stare into the face of the impossible, then laugh nervously and say, well, that could be awkward. So, what if all technology stopped working at once? Not just your Wi-Fi, not just your phone, not just your toaster, all of it. Satellites, planes, nuclear reactors, MRI machines, electric toothbrushes, elevators, insulin pumps, traffic lights, toilets with smart flush sensors. Gone. Every screen is blank, every motor is still, every battery is just a shiny brick with commitment issues. Now you might be thinking, hey, maybe that's not so bad. People survived before electricity, before machines, before cat videos on demand. We'd just go back to basics, right? Churn our own butter, plant potatoes, start singing sea shanties again. Easy. Except no, absolutely not. Because here's the thing. We didn't keep the instruction manual for the pre-electric world. Our ancestors knew how to live without tech because they didn't have a choice. We, on the other hand, can barely navigate our own neighborhoods without GPS. We get emotionally attached to coffee machines. We ask Alexa for bedtime stories. We panic when autocorrect doesn't fix our spelling of the word, definitely. In the first 30 minutes of the great technological blackout, the entire human race collectively experienced the 5 stages of grief, but not in order. Denial lasted about 10 minutes, anger showed up immediately after when someone's TikTok draft disappeared, bargaining began around the time someone tried to blow on their laptop like it was an old Nintendo cartridge, depression hit as soon as someone realized their food delivery app no longer worked, and acceptance, well, we're still waiting on that one. Airplanes fell silent in the sky. Not fell, thank goodness, because gravity is still analog. But they had to glide, emergency land, or just do very long and creative prayers. Cities became frozen ant colonies. The lights died, doors refused to open, and, tragically, no one could post about any of it on social media. The horror. Hospitals faced immediate chaos. No machines meant no diagnostics, no digital records, and absolutely no coffee from the staff lounge Keurig. The real tragedy. Doctors had to suddenly remember what stethoscopes were actually for. Surgeons looked at manual scalpels like ancient relics from an archaeological dig. Financial markets. They didn't crash. They just ceased to exist. Without computers, the idea of numbers with moving decimals becomes just a bunch of lines on paper. A trader tried yelling stock prices across Wall Street. No one knew whether to panic or applaud the historical accuracy. Governments, meanwhile, did what they do best during crises. They formed committees. Many committees. Some even tried to fax each other. Which would have been a brilliant idea, if fax machines still worked and anyone under 40 remembered how to use one. And in households around the world, people began to realize something truly unsettling. They had to speak to each other, face to face, without emojis. Husbands rediscovered their wives. Children found out their parents could, in fact, make eye contact. Families sat together in silence, unsure whether to start a board game or just accept their new Amish destiny. But not all was doom and gloom. In a curious way, there was peace. No buzzing, no beeping, no alerts. Just silence. An unfamiliar kind of quiet settled over the earth. At first it was eerie, like the calm before a haunted house jump scare. But slowly, it became oddly soothing. The world exhaled. Of course, no one could take a photo of it, or tweet about it, or make a podcast. Except me. Because in this fictional universe, I have a magical non-electric microphone powered by curiosity, caffeine, and just enough disbelief to keep us moving forward. And that, dear listeners, is where our story truly begins. In the absence of functioning tech, humans did what they do best in unfamiliar territory. They panicked loudly, blamed each other, and then immediately began inventing terrible solutions. Someone in Sweden tried to restart their laptop by rubbing it with wool socks. A man in Ohio yelled at his car for 20 minutes straight. A small group of hipsters in Brooklyn claimed they'd been living off the grid already, but they were later spotted trying to light a stove using artisanal scented candles. The tech elite, billionaires, Coders, app developers, crypto bros, gathered in Silicon Valley in what can only be described as the world's first Wi-Fi anonymous support group. They sat in beanbags, whispered about JavaScript, and tried to remember how to write by hand. One former CEO tried to reboot a dead server by chanting in binary. Another insisted his smartwatch was just sleeping. Denial, it seems, is a highly scalable product. Meanwhile, humanity was quickly discovering how terrifyingly deep the rabbit hole of dependency went. You didn't just lose Netflix. You lost digital banking. You lost clean water in places where pumps were computer-controlled. You lost climate regulation in massive agricultural zones. Your smart fridge became just a box with regrets and half a cucumber. Cities began to mutate, not with mutants or zombies, this wasn't that kind of apocalypse. But with strange social patterns. Suddenly, the guy who remembered how to fix a bicycle became a neighborhood demigod. The woman who knew how to can peaches was elected mayor of 3 streets. If you could build a fire without YouTube, you were declared royalty. Barter made a massive comeback. And it was weird. One guy traded a frozen chicken for 2 bars of soap and a ukulele. A woman swapped 12Ah batteries for half a bottle of wine in what she claimed was a 2005 Honda Civic manual. Someone else tried to trade a Kindle for a potato, forgetting the Kindle was now just an expensive coaster. People adapted. Badly, but impressively. Cardboard signs appeared with hand-drawn maps and instructions. Strangers began speaking to one another without the safety net of text message buffering. People started writing letters again. Actual letters. On paper. With pens. The mail system, ironically one of the most ancient infrastructures, roared back to life like a forgotten dinosaur thrilled to be invited back to the party. Of course, nothing was simple. Without refrigeration, food had to be eaten fast or preserved the old-fashioned way. Salt became the new gold. Ice was a miracle. Cows were suddenly very popular. Chickens, once adored for their Instagrammability, were now valued for actual eggs. And in the most shocking twist of all, people began sleeping. Really sleeping. 8 full hours. No doomscrolling. No blue light. Just genuine human rest, the kind our ancestors used to brag about before electricity turned us into stressed-out raccoons with email. But while the planet stumbled toward primitive balance, there were questions. Important ones. Could we turn this around? Was this blackout temporary? Was it the result of a massive solar flare? A coordinated EMP attack? A grumpy AI that finally decided it had enough of us asking it to make cat memes? Without satellites, there were no answers. Without radio, there were no broadcasts. Without Twitter, there were no conspiracies. Okay, scratch that. People still made up wild theories, they just had to shout them across parking lots instead of posting them. Scientists, those who still had chalkboards, began working on the problem with frantic intensity. They debated in lecture halls, passed notes like high school students, and relearned how to use analog voltmeters. Physicists mourned their particle accelerators. Biologists cried over defrosted gene samples. One guy tried to build a computer out of clay and hope. And then, of course, came the emergence of tech cults. They wore robes made from Ethernet cables. They prayed to the spirit of silicon. They believed the great reboot was coming, and when it did, only those with full bars of karma would survive. Some tried to charge phones using lemons. Others chanted Gregorian versions of startup jingles. It was all very weird, but also oddly human. In the middle of it all, something else began to surface. Creativity. People began to invent not just out of necessity, but out of boredom. With no screens to distract them, the imagination engine went into overdrive. Children made elaborate board games using bottle caps and broom handles. Adults painted, sang, built elaborate contraptions that may or may not have violated several safety laws. And for the first time in decades, the stars were visible. Not through telescopes, but with naked eyes. Whole families lay in fields, pointing upward, realizing that the Milky Way had always been there. Just hidden behind pixels and pixels of distraction. It wasn't all beautiful, of course. There were dark corners. Medicine was scarce. Heat was unpredictable. People who depended on life-sustaining devices faced brutal odds. We can't romanticize everything, but in the middle of all the uncertainty, there was one undeniable truth. We remembered how fragile the digital scaffolding really was. And how lost we'd become inside it. That realization would spark something strange. Something unpredictable, not just a survival instinct, but a question no one expected to ask. What if this wasn't a glitch? What if it was a chance? Of course, not everyone thought of it as a chance. To most, it still felt like a cosmic betrayal. People were used to updates, patches, hotfixes, problems that could be solved with a polite call to IT or an impolite slam of the power button. But this was an apocalypse with no buffering symbol, no spinning wheel of hope. The world kept turning, but clumsily. Planes remained grounded, which was great for geese and awful for anyone stuck at Terminal 3 of any airport. Trains sat frozen on tracks like confused metal snakes. Even cruise ships, those floating buffets of questionable decisions, were marooned mid-ocean, forcing thousands to rediscover the lost art of not vomiting on open water. Back on land, the tech-savvy found themselves painfully irrelevant. The person who once optimized cloud infrastructure was now learning how to optimize a wood-burning stove. Influencers, those who had built empires on filtered selfies and 30-second dance clips, were reduced to shouting motivational quotes at squirrels. Likes, follows, and shares had been replaced by grunts of acknowledgement and occasional high-fives. In the power vacuum left by digital collapse, analog skills roared back like a nostalgic rock band on a comeback tour. Fixing broken tools, reading actual paper maps, making fire without yelling at Alexa, these talents, once considered charming quirks, were now life-sustaining assets. The nerds of yesterday became the chieftains of today. If you could hunt, stitch, plant, or build, you were suddenly the MVP of your neighborhood. Kids adapted fast. They had no TikTok, so they invented elaborate games involving tree bark, rubber bands, and imagination. Some claimed it was more fun than screen time. Others said that until candy returned, nothing was truly fun. Regardless, they were at least outside, sunburned, and occasionally covered in mud, hallmarks of childhood that had become rare during the touchscreen era. Adults took longer. Many tried to recreate the old ways. They organized town meetings, formed coalitions, and even attempted to hold votes. The first post-tech election involved writing names on dried pasta and placing them into hats. It was chaos, but oddly democratic. One mayor was elected because she made the best pickles. Another won because he owned a ladder. Meanwhile, rumors spread like wildfire. One said there was still one working satellite, spinning silently above, recording everything. Another claimed a secret bunker in Iceland still had power, guarded by solar panels and sheep. Some whispered about a hidden society of engineers, fixing everything in secret, waiting for the perfect dramatic entrance. Probably with theme music. But amidst the uncertainty, a strange calm began to settle. It was not peace exactly, more like the exhausted acceptance of a marathon runner who realizes there's still another 20 miles to go but decides to keep moving anyway. People began to look at each other again, not through glass screens, but with real eye contact, which, frankly, made many uncomfortable at first. There were awkward conversations, strangers reintroducing themselves to neighbors, couples realizing they actually had to talk to each other now, families discovering the dinner table was more than just a charger station. It was intimate, unfiltered, occasionally full of peas. Without distractions, silence made a bold return. It crept into evenings, wrapped around bedrooms, stretched across parks. It was unnerving at first, like an unexpected guest who didn't know how to leave. But eventually, it became a friend, a reminder that beneath the noise, there was still something steady and ancient in us all. Not everything was poetic. Bathrooms became a problem, especially in high rises. Elevators didn't work, toilets stopped flushing. Suddenly, the term, walk-up apartment, took on grim new meaning. People got creative, buckets were involved, and a kind of solidarity formed around the fact that nobody smelled great anymore. Food supply chains, those invisible veins that pumped groceries across countries, broke down hard. Supermarkets were raided within hours. Not violently, just efficiently. The yogurt aisle was abandoned quickly, but the canned beans section became a gladiator arena. Some formed co-ops, others grew desperate, but for the most part, people shared what they could. Because when there are no online delivery options left, your neighbor becomes your most valuable app. In the absence of screens, storytelling came back. Real, oral storytelling, around campfires, in parks, in living rooms lit with candles. Grandparents told tales of how they survived the 70s without smartphones. Children exaggerated recent events into epic myths. Someone even tried to rewrite Star Wars using only shadow puppets and a broomstick. And as the world stumbled towards something that vaguely resembled function, a deeper question lingered. What did it mean to be connected? Before, we thought connection meant Wi-Fi, notifications, syncing. But now, connection was the sound of shared laughter over a failed soup experiment. It was helping someone dig a ditch for a makeshift toilet. It was lending your last 2 matches to someone you barely knew. This wasn't the world we had planned. But maybe, just maybe, it was a world where we could finally see each other again. Without filters, without distractions, just flesh, blood, and an unhealthy obsession with peanut butter rations. And somewhere, buried deep under all the panic and nostalgia, a new possibility began to rise. One that didn't need a power cord. A future built not on code, but on community. By the end of the first month, people had either adapted or spectacularly failed to. The line between survivalist and overly enthusiastic cosplayer grew thinner by the day. There were those who wore furs, painted their faces with berry juice, and declared themselves the new druids of a digital-less age. Then there were others who simply missed microwave popcorn and wondered aloud if this was all just a very elaborate prank show that had gone way too far. Cities changed shape. Skyscrapers stood like monolithic fossils from a tech-driven past. Useless elevators turned them into modern-day cliffs. Rooftop gardens bloomed where helipads once sat idle. Streets, once clogged with honking cars and angry tweets, now echoed with the sound of feet, bicycle bells, and the occasional goat. Public libraries, long considered endangered species, became temples of wisdom. Books, those dusty things once used as decorative shelf fillers, returned as priceless sources of information. People lined up to learn things like how to sew, how to filter water, and how to make bread without crying. Librarians were promoted from background figures to cultural shamans. There were stumbles, huge ones. A group tried to bring back currency using acorns. Another believed pigeons could replace text messaging. Spoiler alert, pigeons cannot. At least not reliably. But the spirit of trial and error became a kind of unspoken motto. No one knew what they were doing, and that was okay. Because no one was pretending to have a better app for it. Religions evolved. Some started worshipping the last remaining battery-powered flashlight. Others preached that the outage was divine punishment for downloading too many food delivery apps. Philosophers emerged with grand theories. One insisted that the gods were just tired of hearing our phone alarms every morning. Another said the asteroid belt finally got sick of our Instagram reels. Meanwhile, the great thinkers, previously YouTubers with reaction channels, pivoted to live philosophy sessions, done through interpretive dance and chalk drawings. It was absurd, and beautiful, and sometimes genuinely insightful, even when it involved a man pretending to be Plato using only a bedsheet and a bucket of mashed potatoes. And then there were the songs. New ones. Songs about missing the internet, about learning to love lanterns, about discovering your spouse is really into competitive knitting. Music returned to porches, parks, and wherever someone had an old guitar and just enough ego to use it. The unplugged era wasn't just literal, it became a mood, a vibe, a shrug followed by a smile. One might assume that governments would crumble under this tech blackout. And they sort of did. But in strange, decentralized ways. Without mass surveillance, propaganda returned to its analog roots. Flyers, whisper campaigns, a guy named Tony who swore he knew what was really going on. Democracy became more interpretive. Debates were held via town squares and competitive gardening. Political scandals were now limited to whose goat had eaten whose carrots. But the most unexpected development. People got weirdly creative. Without the algorithm dictating their attention span, the human brain began to uncoil itself. Artists who had once begged for followers now painted entire building walls with murals of giant turtles wearing togas. Poets read odes to compost. Even accountants started writing haikus about tax returns that would never be filed. The absence of convenience unearthed something primal. People remembered what boredom felt like, and how it could breed mischief, curiosity, or both. Campfire debates raged on topics like which pre-apocalypse TV character would survive best, or whether pigeons were secretly judging us for our former dependence on GPS. Despite everything, people laughed. They laughed at how useless their smart fridges had been in the end. At how everyone had once believed their phones were extensions of their souls. At how social media influencers now had to influence things like water purification and goat herding. Children born after the blackout knew nothing of notifications. They played in the dirt, made up languages, and believed stories about Google to be ancient myths. Some even doubted it had ever existed, like Atlantis or honest politicians. For them, the world was smaller but brighter. No screens meant no distractions from clouds, bugs, and whatever odd thing Uncle Tim was trying to cook over an open flame again. The elderly, surprisingly, became the gurus. They remembered life before digital everything. Their tales of landlines, mixtapes, and not knowing something immediately were treasured like ancient scrolls. Teens gathered around them, wide-eyed, when they explained what "be kind rewind" meant or how to drive stick shift. The elders had become the new influencers, and not a single one of them needed a ring light. In the middle of it all, one truth emerged more clearly than ever. Technology had always promised to bring us closer. And for a while, it had. But it had also created walls. Shiny, smooth, swipeable walls. Now those were gone, and what stood in their place were human beings. Flawed, sweaty, resourceful, sometimes insufferable, but undeniably real. Sure, people missed the ease, the instant gratification, the playlists and emojis and ability to pretend you were busy by opening Excel and staring at it blankly. But they also discovered something else. Something raw, that the world didn't end. It merely rebooted into something stranger, harder, and perhaps more human than ever. And somewhere, among all the candlelit chaos, someone said, maybe this was what we needed all along. Not forever, but just long enough to remember how to live without being told how. There's a moment that happens in every collective crisis when denial finally dies a quiet death, and it's usually replaced by awkward acceptance. That's where we were. Humanity, once a species of proud button pressers and screen glancers, was now fully embracing the age of smoke signals, errand boys, and unintentionally ironic irony. Daily life became something out of a Wes Anderson film written by a confused survivalist. Without alarms, people woke up when the sun hit their faces or when the neighborhood rooster, now a local celebrity, crowed on top of someone's broken satellite dish. Meetings, no longer zoomed or doodled into oblivion, happened because someone physically shouted, "Hey, meeting at the fountain in 10. Bring a chair and your dignity." Time itself got weird. Without digital clocks synchronizing every heartbeat of society, appointments became flexible. A vague tomorrow morning or just after lunch, depending on when we finish gutting the fish, became perfectly acceptable timeframes. Watches were back in fashion, but half of them didn't work, and the other half were worn just to impress people with your ability to tell time without asking the sun. The fashion industry, hilariously, collapsed and reformed like a phoenix made of hemp. With no online shopping and no next-day delivery, people wore what they had, what they could barter for, or what they could sew out of curtains. Utility met absurdity in glorious collision. People wore mismatched boots and hats made from colanders. Socks were currency. Overalls made a comeback so aggressive that denim began to look like a natural skin. Let's talk about communication, or rather, the lack thereof. The first few weeks were a disaster. Long-distance relationships wilted like spinach on a grill. People rediscovered the postal system but forgot how addresses worked. There were intense debates over whether attaching a note to a dog was genius or animal cruelty. Carrier pigeons made a minor comeback until it was discovered that most modern pigeons had the IQ of an avocado and a talent for flying into walls. But slowly, very slowly, people adjusted. They learned to write again. Like, properly, with pens. Cursive even made a surprise reappearance, now a form of street cred. Love letters returned with such vengeance that teenage romance surged in popularity, causing minor panic among parents who now had no spyware to snoop through. Gossip became a full-contact sport, spreading orally with the velocity of wildfire and the accuracy of a potato gun. Meanwhile, education did a weird backflip. Without online classes, parents had to homeschool their children using only books, drawings, and the desperate hope that nobody would ask what mitochondria actually do. Universities fell apart, and in their place rose the street university of Old Dave, who once worked in IT and now taught critical thinking using chessboards and jars of pickles. Entertainment didn't die, it just went feral. Live theater exploded. Parks hosted dramatic reenactments of films remembered vaguely from memory. Someone performed Titanic using sock puppets and sheer overconfidence. The soundtracks, hummed by volunteers. Someone made a full-length rendition of Lord of the Rings, complete with homemade wigs, a garden gnome as Gandalf, and an old shoe as the One Ring. Sports were reinvented too. Without live broadcasts, games became more intimate. Soccer was played barefoot. Baseball turned into stickball with questionable rule enforcement. One group invented a sport involving stilts, spoons, and goats. The goats won every time. The black market blossomed, naturally. Batteries were traded like gold. Candles became contraband. A well-oiled hand crank radio was worth more than your cousin's car. People whispered of a man named Roger who had a working toaster and the audacity to use it every Sunday just to taunt the neighborhood with the smell of warm bread. Despite the weirdness, or maybe because of it, humanity became more human. Without the filters, avatars, and curated feeds, people were just people again. Messy, unpredictable, occasionally unbearable, but refreshingly present. Arguments still happened, of course. Loud, gesturing arguments that started over burnt soup and spiraled into political theory. But they ended faster too. It's hard to hold a grudge when your only light source is a shared candle and you need the other person to help wind the weather radio. And then came the artists. Freed from digital constraints and endless scrolling, creativity exploded like a shaken soda can. Painters used mud and beet juice. Writers carved stories into wood. Musicians composed symphonies using pots, pans, and that one neighbor with a hauntingly good whistling ability. People started appreciating silence too. Actual, unfiltered, bird-chirping silence. No constant buzz, no notification pings, no accidental autoplay videos screaming at full volume. Just quiet. At first, it unnerved them. Then it comforted them. Some said they heard their own thoughts for the first time in years and were horrified, then amused, then oddly inspired. Even dreams became weirder. No longer influenced by glowing screens and midnight TikTok rabbit holes, people dreamed of forests, flying, and occasionally, that one time they forgot to wear pants to a meeting that no longer existed. Therapists flourished, now operating out of treehouses and charging in bartered hugs and jam jars. The irony: we began connecting more, not through fiber optics or satellite dishes, but through awkward eye contact and shared chores. Communities, once walled off by Wi-Fi passwords and garage doors, now built communal gardens, shared meals, and hosted talent shows judged by an elderly woman with a bell and zero patience for off-key singing. We became vulnerable again, and that made us honest. Honest in our fears, our joy, and our absolutely chaotic attempts at rebuilding meaning. For better or worse, we had unplugged. And though the world felt broken, it also felt alive. We'll pause here and continue in the next part with the unexpected new rules that emerged, the surprising rise of librarians as leaders, and whether or not anyone ever found out how to make toast without crying. The thing about sudden apocalypse-style events, especially the non-explosive, passive-aggressive kind like technology just ghosting us, is that humans don't just adapt. They improvise, often in the most bizarre, impractical, and occasionally genius ways imaginable. Take leadership, for example. With governments struggling to do anything without emails or spreadsheets, power shifted. Not to those with weapons, nor to the richest among us, but to an unlikely class of people who'd long been ignored by the modern world. Librarians. Yes, librarians. The keepers of knowledge. The silent sentinels of the Dewey Decimal System. Once underestimated, now suddenly revered. With Google out of commission and Wikipedia reduced to nostalgic tears, people flocked to the only remaining search engine that wore cardigans and shushed you for breathing too loudly. Libraries became fortresses, knowledge temples, places where people whispered, not out of respect, but because the head librarian, a woman named Edna with the quiet fury of 1,000 burning suns, would snap you into silence with one raised eyebrow. In a world of chaos, she ruled with bookmarks and discipline. You needed to know how to grow tomatoes. Edna had a book. Wanted to build a windmill. Edna handed you a dusty manual from 1973. Curious about how to make soap from pig fat. Guess who had a detailed diagram annotated in pencil? The age of the librarian overlords began with no ceremony and yet full legitimacy. And honestly, it worked. Meanwhile, the economy had the grace of a soap opera with amnesia. Banks were, how shall we say, confused. Without computers, the numbers meant nothing. Your account balance was now a theoretical concept, like time travel or a guilt-free donut. Bartering returned, not in the cool, old world, leather pouches and gold coins kind of way, but in the awkward, modern relearning kind. Imagine someone trying to trade a half-used yoga mat for 6 eggs and a tutorial on canning tomatoes. This was daily life. The barter economy was a circus with no ringmaster and a constant shortage of toilet paper. Coffee became a black market obsession. People whispered about a guy who had a stash of instant packets buried somewhere under a tree. Entire communities organized search parties. Decaf drinkers were shunned like they had personally unplugged the internet. As for health care, well, doctors did their best. Without online charts, apps, or the ability to Google symptoms, don't pretend you never did, medicine took a step backward. Old school diagnostic skills came back. Doctors felt pulses, looked in ears with flashlights, and started muttering phrases like "this smells like strep again." Witchcraft levels of guesswork surged. Herbalists and grannies with soup recipes were suddenly popular. Some guy in Oregon became famous for curing rashes with a paste made of mint, regret, and something he called healing vibes. Dentists had a rough time. Without their beeping gadgets and panoramic X-rays, they operated like medieval blacksmiths. Brave souls entered the chair. Few returned without a traumatic appreciation for Novocaine. But perhaps the weirdest shift of all was how people entertained themselves. Without screens to melt our brains, humans had to actually create fun. And not the algorithm-approved, clickbait-driven fun. Real, chaotic, often nonsensical fun. Neighborhoods formed improv troupes. People reenacted TV shows from memory, which led to delightful disasters like Breaking Bad performed by children who'd never seen it. Spoiler: Walter White was a baker. Jesse was a cat. The meth was flour. Card games became high art. Uno tournaments involved bribes, secret alliances, and dramatic speeches. Monopoly caused civil wars. Risk was banned in 4 provinces after the great betrayal of Frank, who flipped the board and fled on a bicycle. Even news changed. No longer curated by faceless networks or mysterious algorithms, the Daily Bulletin was read aloud by Barry, a former accountant with excellent enunciation. He stood on a crate in the town square, wearing a bathrobe and holding a megaphone, updating everyone on weather, sightings of working blenders, and the weekly goat parade schedule. And yes, there were goat parades. Don't ask. You had to be there. Romance, by the way, evolved in unexpected ways. Without dating apps or curated selfies, people met the old-fashioned way. In real life, accidentally, at markets, during arguments about who stole the last jar of pickled carrots. Pickup lines were once again verbal disasters. "Did it hurt when you fell from heaven" was replaced by "I noticed your chickens are healthy." Wanna collaborate? Flirting required eye contact, humor, and an uncanny knowledge of composting. It was terrifying, and oddly charming, and somewhere in all this madness, humanity remembered something it hadn't felt in years. Stillness. Not boredom, which is a uniquely modern problem requiring a constant feed of memes. But true stillness. The quiet after dinner when there's no screen to stare at. The sound of wind. The crackle of a fire. The sudden, stunning realization that maybe, just maybe, there was life beyond the rectangle. And of course, not everyone was having a wholesome spiritual awakening. Some people still screamed at toasters. Some blamed the government. Others tried to reboot their routers every day like a ritual sacrifice. But the rage faded. The grief turned into curiosity. And society began to rebuild. Just not in the way it had been. Up next, we'll explore how art and music redefined civilization, why one man declared himself king of post-its, and how pigeons became shockingly competent couriers after a nationwide effort to retrain them using motivational breadcrumbs. Now, we've covered the initial panic, the libraries, and how people started making do with what they had. But let's shift gears and talk about the creative rebirth that emerged from the ashes of the digital world. In a time where you couldn't just Google how to make art, people had to rely on their instincts, or, in some cases, a crayon and an unsupervised child. Let's talk about art first. With no Instagram to post on or Facebook to share it, art became real again. People started creating for themselves, not for likes or follows. The baristas who once crafted latte art that looked like anime characters now found themselves carving intricate sculptures from bark, potato peels, and, well, whatever else they could find that didn't require electricity. Some folks turned to traditional mediums, oil paints, charcoal, even pencil. Not for the sake of impressing anyone, but for the pure, unfiltered joy of seeing something appear on a blank canvas. The art world returned to its roots, or should I say, the art world went back to its garage sale roots. You'd be surprised how many masterpieces were created in basements with a single light bulb and a broken chair. As for music, oh, it got weird. Without digital music streaming services, or Spotify to organize your playlists, humans were forced to rely on the ancient art of playing an instrument. I know, shocking, right? Guitars were dusted off, pianos were tuned, and people actually started composing music for fun. Some bands played rock and roll with an edge of pure confusion, using pots, pans, and what I can only assume were a couple of angry squirrels for percussion. But hey, it was live. Street performers popped up everywhere. Everywhere you went, you'd see an impromptu violinist playing somewhere between Beethoven and Twinkle, Twinkle Little Star. And the saxophonists. Oh, the saxophonists. It was like a weird love affair between jazz and chaos. Every alley turned into an open-air concert hall, and nothing got the neighbors more riled up than a sax solo played at 2 in the morning. But then, of course, came the performances. People started acting again, performing in ways that felt more spontaneous. No more reality TV shows for people to waste their time on. No more scripts dictated by producers. The streets became open theaters, and every cafe became the stage for impromptu one-act plays about the meaning of life, based entirely on a discussion about why squirrels like to chew on car tires. The best part, nobody was trying to get famous. No one cared if their performance got shared across the world, because there wasn't a World Wide Web to share it with anymore. All the old motivations for fame and fortune had disappeared, leaving only the raw desire to express oneself. To make something, anything, that wasn't just another selfie with a filter. Now, while art and music took a joyous, wild turn, let's discuss something that people definitely didn't expect to rise from the ashes: the world of manual labor. Oh yes, with technology out of the picture, the physical work world had a serious comeback. Gone were the days when your phone could do everything from scheduling your laundry to telling you the exact moment when you should water your plants. No, now we had to feel the earth. Really get our hands dirty. People rediscovered farming. You thought farming was a thing of the past. Not anymore. People were planting crops like they were about to start a new civilization, or at least a very large salad. Cabbages became the currency of the future. People started swapping heirloom tomatoes for tools, and anyone who could grow a decent carrot suddenly held more power than your average tech CEO. And don't get me started on the rise of the local farmers market. They were thriving, like you've never seen before. People were bartering jars of pickles for a single chicken egg. It was beautiful, and a little odd. Oh, and the tradespeople. They were the new superheroes. Plumbers, carpenters, electricians, yes, even the old school ones who didn't need a phone to look up wiring diagrams, they became the backbone of society. With no phone apps to show us how to change a light bulb or fix a leaky faucet, we had to go back to the old school ways. And you know what? People learned things. They learned how to use a wrench. They learned how to hammer nails without hitting their thumb. Which, let's face it, was an achievement in itself. Now, I know what you're thinking. What about the apocalypse of information? Surely, a world without technology is a world without access to knowledge. What happened to our obsession with trivia? Was the age of podcasts, search engines, and instant facts gone forever? Well, sort of. The funny thing about humans is that they're incredibly resourceful. So, people created new ways of communicating information. Without Google, we went back to the ancient art of word of mouth. Yes, the whisper network made its grand return. And while we may have lost some of the nuance of true facts, we gained a new layer of interpretation. By the time you heard the third version of how to restart a car engine, it was entirely different from the first. But it worked, sort of. Now, you might think that this tech-less world would fall into a state of total chaos. No more online shopping, no more tweeting about your breakfast. But the funny thing is, people got by. We adapted. Sure, it was inconvenient. Sure, it was a little bit like watching a giant group of toddlers trying to figure out how to rebuild a civilization with only a Lego set and an expired coupon for a pizza. But we did it, and some of the changes were good. Really good. Life was simpler, quieter, and far more connected, if a bit more chaotic. Up next, we'll explore the revolution of transportation, the rise of the great bakeries, and how an unlikely man from Idaho became the king of the art of storytelling. If you thought the fall of smartphones was dramatic, wait until you hear what happened to transportation. Remember cars, planes, that whole system of getting from point A to point B without breaking a sweat or growing a beard along the way. Yeah, those were the days. With all modern vehicles rendered useless, because, surprise, most of them rely on computers now, the world had to rediscover the thrill of motion, manually. At first, it was chaos. People tried pushing their cars, which, while noble, proved less than efficient. There were brief attempts at using rollerblades again, which led to a nationwide spike in knee injuries and public embarrassment. Someone in Ohio tried riding a refrigerator downhill. That was short-lived. The renaissance of transportation came when people dusted off the true MVPs of the pre-digital world, bicycles. Bikes became the new Lamborghinis. You couldn't walk down the street without seeing a proud human polishing their two-wheeled steed like it was a sacred artifact. Every family had one, and those who didn't became deeply envious of neighbors who could pedal to the community market in style. Of course, some people got creative. One man welded 3 bikes together into a tri-tandem mutant machine he called the Centipede. It did not turn well. Horse-drawn carts made a majestic return. Some communities even formed equestrian taxi services. Admittedly, they were slow, smelled a bit odd, and the horses were divas, but hey, it beat walking 20 miles with a sack of onions. A few bold souls attempted to reinvent hot air balloons, though results ranged from whimsical to wildly irresponsible. Still, it was transportation with flair. With the pace of life literally slowed, people started appreciating the journey again. Walking became an actual activity. People greeted each other on the streets. Entire conversations happened between people who were not secretly watching a TikTok over your shoulder while nodding along. Children discovered sidewalks. Adults rediscovered thighs. But perhaps no transformation was more touching, or tastier, than the rise of the neighborhood bakery. See, without mass-produced, store-bought bread or food delivery apps, society had to fend for itself. And when it comes to survival, nothing inspires unity quite like the smell of fresh sourdough wafting through the air. People began baking, not as a hobby, but as a necessity. Ovens were lit, yeast was traded like treasure. Sourdough starters were treated like heirlooms. Someone made a croissant so good, it was declared legally sacred by a small village council. With every block having at least one skilled baker, bread became the new community currency. There were whole debates about crust thickness, interior crumb structure, and whether adding olives made you an innovator or a war criminal. People gathered around bread like they once did around Netflix. The baker became the center of social life. If you had flour, you had power. Of course, where there's bread, there's community. And where there's community, there's storytelling. In the absence of entertainment streaming services, humanity returned to its most ancient and effective pastime, sitting in a circle and telling stories, often dramatically, sometimes truthfully, occasionally fueled by one too many fermented blackberry meads. Enter Harold from Idaho. No one knows how Harold became the legend he did. At first glance, he was just a man with suspenders and a questionable beard. But what Harold had was voice, charisma, and the ability to stretch a 3-minute incident into a 3-hour saga that involved betrayal, redemption, and at least one rogue raccoon. Every night, people gathered in abandoned parking lots or old libraries with candles lit and snacks in hand to hear storytellers like Harold spin tales. They spoke of ancient empires, suburban drama, and wild speculative fiction about what life used to be like when people had rectangles in their pockets that yelled at them to hydrate. Some storytellers even became traveling performers, walking from town to town spreading news, rumors, and badly remembered Shakespeare. This, naturally, led to the rise of the gossip bard, a new class of entertainer who mixed local updates with limericks. People tuned in with their ears. Yes, ears, those things we used before podcasts. Without TV or the internet, your average human's attention span doubled, maybe tripled. People didn't just listen, they focused. Stories had time to breathe. There were intermissions for snacks. Arguments broke out over plot twists. Wait, Karen was the killer. I thought she was in the garden planting radishes. And yes, every town had a Karen. And she was often up to something suspicious. Meanwhile, schools and education had to adapt too. Without tablets or projectors, the blackboard made a glorious return. Teachers relearned the dark art of chalk, and students discovered the joy of erasers that didn't smell like vanilla plastic. Lessons were taught using books, physical ones, with pages and that strange musty smell of forgotten knowledge. Kids began to memorize things again. Multiplication tables, the state capitals, the plot of the Iliad, as told by Harold from Idaho. Education became oral, visual, physical. People learned by doing. You didn't just hear about science, you went outside and experienced it. Gravity was demonstrated with melons. Chemistry became cooking. Physics involved building giant seesaws and launching unfortunate vegetables. And let's not forget fashion. With online shopping decimated, people turned to crafting their own clothes. Fashion took on a bold, occasionally horrifying flair. People wore what they had, and they owned it. Bedsheets as togas, scarves as belts. One man walked around in a full curtain ensemble and claimed to be starting a trend. And he did. That's how trends work now. You just did it, and if someone copied you, it was fashion. There was freedom in this chaos. You didn't have to match. You didn't need brands. You needed only confidence and the willingness to walk outside looking like a Victorian ghost crossed with a summer camp escapee. But through it all, through the storytelling, the biking, the bread baking, and the suspicious curtain wearing, people began to feel something strange. Something they hadn't felt in years. Connection. Real, unfiltered, slightly awkward human connection. In the next part, we'll dive into what came next. How politics shifted without digital propaganda, how people formed new governments with chalkboards and yelling, and how humanity redefined what power meant when your loudest microphone was literally your own lungs. Now, when every last screen went black and every social media platform vanished into the digital void like a magician's rabbit, something incredibly awkward happened. Politics had to go analog. Imagine campaigning without ads, bots, viral videos, or poorly photoshopped memes of your opponent hugging a duck. Political influence returned to its primal form. Shouting, walking door to door, and bribing people with home-baked cookies. At first, chaos. Governments, which relied heavily on computers for communication, logistics, and hiding minor scandals, were caught pants down in the digital darkness. The initial response was, of course, denial. Officials stood behind wooden podiums and declared, confidently, that the outage was temporary. Meanwhile, their aides were in the background trying to fax their resumes to Canada. With no access to databases or encrypted emails, power dynamics shifted. The old political elite lost their grip, not because they were less powerful, but because they couldn't remember anyone's phone number. Meanwhile, the people who had printed maps, basic survival skills, and the ability to speak in full paragraphs without looking at a screen suddenly found themselves rising in popularity. Local leadership re-emerged like mold in a damp sock drawer. Neighborhood councils sprang up organically. Some were run democratically, others by charismatic bakers or the guy with the only working water well. In one town, a woman who owned 5 goats was declared mayor. In another, the title of sheriff was given to a retired gym teacher with an impressive mustache and a firm handshake. Laws became optional, or rather, reinvented. Without an internet full of legal texts or access to federal databases, rules were decided locally. Justice was swift, often nonsensical, and sometimes hilarious. One village banned spoons because someone claimed they were cursed. Another required all disputes to be settled via limerick competitions. Courtrooms were held in coffee shops. Judges wore bathrobes. Order was, at best, interpretive. But amid the confusion, something surprising happened. Without the algorithmic rage machine feeding people outrage every 3 minutes, tempers began to cool. People disagreed. Sure, but they had to do it face to face. You couldn't scream in all caps from behind a screen anymore. You had to stand in a town hall and make your point while everyone watched you sweat through your recycled sweater. Turns out, in-person accountability is a powerful thing. It's hard to call someone a soulless goblin to their face and still expect a slice of their legendary pumpkin pie afterward. People began to argue less and listen more. Debates became actual debates. Not great ones, mind you, this is still humanity we're talking about, but they involved fewer chairs being thrown. And then came the philosophers. You know the type. Once harmless academics, They emerged from dusty basements like intellectual cicadas, blinking in the sunlight and clutching their leather notebooks. Suddenly, everyone wanted answers. What does society mean without technology? What is progress? What is TikTok, and why do I remember nothing from it except a dance and mild shame? With public hunger for direction and no TED Talks in sight, philosophy circles exploded. Every third person became a thought leader. They gave talks in barns, in parks, even in the ruins of old shopping malls. Some waxed poetic about minimalism, others shouted about the tyranny of forks. It was a golden age of ideas and deeply questionable logic. But the biggest revelation of all came not from politics, philosophy, or poetry. It came from silence. You see, in the absence of the digital hum, the constant pinging, buzzing, chirping, and vibrating that had once defined our lives, people realized just how loud the world had been. The silence was unsettling at first, like stepping into a soundproof room after a lifetime in a casino. But then, it became beautiful. People began to listen to birds. Not in a quirky, I guess I'm a bird person now, way, but with genuine awe. Some started mimicking them. One guy even ran a bird choir. It was terrible, but he was happy. Without podcasts, people told stories to themselves. Without GPS, people explored. Without screens, people looked at faces, at clouds, at their own weird thoughts. Kids grew up climbing trees instead of leveling up avatars. Teenagers passed notes again, some even written on scented paper. Adults, freed from the pressure of productivity apps and calendar syncs, took naps. And nobody judged them. They actually bragged about it. Of course, not everything was idyllic. Some tried desperately to rebuild their digital lives. One man attempted to recreate Twitter using pigeons. Another made a hand-drawn version of YouTube using a public notice board and stick figure comics. There were mixed reviews. Eventually, people stopped trying to rebuild the old world and began crafting a new one. One that was slower, yes, messier, but more human. A world where the first question wasn't "What do you do?" or "What's your Wi-Fi password?" but simply, "How are you?" And when you answered, someone actually listened. Which brings us to the final part of this journey. A look forward, not at what we lost, but what we gained. What happens when the world doesn't reboot? When humanity leans into the unknown, without a touchscreen or smart assistant to guide us? The first sunrise after the digital blackout looked the same. Birds chirped, clouds drifted, and somewhere, a cow mooed with majestic indifference. But for humanity, everything had changed. We had stepped into a new era, barefoot, blinking, and with pockets full of now useless plastic rectangles. At first, there was denial. Surely, someone would fix it. A technician in a secret basement, a billionaire in a space suit, maybe even a raccoon who had accidentally rebooted the grid. But as the days stretched into weeks, and weeks into months, hope of restoration faded like your grandma's favorite curtain. This was not a temporary inconvenience. This was our new reality. And in that reality, something remarkable began to grow: imagination. Raw, untamed, gloriously impractical imagination. People who had spent years coding apps for pet dating suddenly found themselves building community ovens, drawing art with natural dyes, or writing operas about turnip cultivation. Former influencers, stripped of their algorithmic fuel, learned to bake sourdough and rediscover their personalities. Some found they had none, which was unfortunate. But others discovered they were delightful without filters. Without instant communication, long-distance friendships became epistolary masterpieces. Letters weren't just messages. They were events. Envelopes were sealed with wax. Some contained doodles. One included a dried mushroom that nobody could identify, and 3 people got mildly sick. But it was worth it. School became a living thing. No more Zoom. No more multiple choice tests. Kids learned math by building treehouses, physics by falling out of them, and history by interviewing their elders, who suddenly went from overlooked to invaluable. Grandparents were promoted to professors of everything. They told stories, taught knitting, and finally got the respect their soup recipes deserved. Meanwhile, science did not vanish. It adapted. Laboratories moved outdoors. Scientists relearned how to record data on paper, sometimes with feathers, sometimes with charcoal. A few attempted to create lab mice out of actual mice, leading to one tragic and very chewed-up notebook. Medicine faced challenges, but innovation bloomed. Ancient herbal knowledge returned to the spotlight, and community healers became rock stars. Not literal rock stars, though someone did try to form a folk band called the Inflamed Lymph Nodes. Romance changed too. Without dating apps, people had to do something terrifying: make eye contact. Courtship returned to handwritten notes, awkward small talk at the village well, and earnest stammering under the stars. Proposals often involved poetry, sometimes even goats. One wedding featured a ceremonial exchange of chickens. It was, frankly, beautiful. Work, that former tyrant of the modern soul, underwent a philosophical revolution. With no screens to tether people to cubicles or track their productivity in 5-minute increments, society had to ask, what is actually necessary? Spoiler alert: not quarterly synergy audits. People found meaning in growing food, making things with their hands, caring for others. Jobs weren't just transactions, they were part of a fabric. The economy became less about competition and more about cooperation. Well, unless someone tried to barter a wet sock for a wheelbarrow. Even in a utopia, you need standards. Art flourished, not the slick, gallery-approved kind, but the messy, chaotic, soul-spilling kind. Murals appeared on barn walls. Music echoed from courtyards. Poetry was performed in fields, often involving interpretive dance by someone's overly enthusiastic aunt. Religion and spirituality found fertile ground, too, not necessarily in organized form, but in the quiet moments. In candlelit gatherings, in shared meals, in whispered gratitude that the stars were still there, even when the internet wasn't. And eventually, a kind of global humility set in. The realization that for all our tech, all our progress, all our gadgets and glowing things, we were always fragile. A network of skin and hope, pretending we were invincible. But when it all fell away, we didn't crumble. We remembered how to be human. We remembered that conversation is more nourishing than scrolling. That silence is not the enemy. That mystery is not something to be eliminated, but something to be embraced. Would some people go back if they could? Sure, there were things we lost. Medicines, connections, access, convenience. But for many, the new world felt more alive, more honest, less optimized, more real. And as generations passed, children born into this unplugged existence grew up never knowing the anxiety of forgotten passwords, the curse of buffering, or the existential dread of a 1% battery warning during a Zoom interview. They built their dreams not with code, but with clay. Not in simulations, but in soil. They still had stories of the old world. Whispered tales of glowing rectangles, of voices trapped in glass, of people who walked around with hunched necks and eternal thumb cramps. And they asked, was it real? Did it make people happy? And nobody quite knew how to answer. Now, as we wrap up, you might be asking, so what's the point? The point is, everything you think you need, you probably don't. Everything you think is permanent, isn't. And sometimes, when the lights go out, it's the first time you can finally see. Thanks for walking through this unplugged reality with me. If you enjoyed this journey, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to What If Horizons, assuming you still have electricity, a device, and this whole thing wasn't just hand-delivered on cassette by a guy on a bike. See you in the next speculative spiral. Or don't. Who knows what will break next?